The world level 5.8 meter class races for 2025 have now begun. The battle of getting ready has now been replaced with the battle of the open ocean. It's a different challenge altogether now. It's a challenge of trusting all of the preparation you have done with yourself and your vessel. It's a challenge of wits and making good decisions. Let's make a comparison with some things we see all the time on shore. How many times have you heard these sorts of true-to-life stories? And these are true stories, and not necessarily about sailing either. So first, an experienced driver toughs out a schedule, falls asleep at the wheel, and gets into a fatal accident. Or this, an experienced sailor makes a novice mistake, transiting a channel that they know well, but somehow runs their boat that they have poured their whole life into, hopelessly aground on a lee shore. Here's another one. An experienced airplane pilot crashes into a mountainside even though they have had many hours of flight experience, had perfectly working instruments, charts, and air traffic controllers guiding them. These are stories of experienced people making seemingly out-of-character mistakes. But what does that have to do with sailing on the open ocean? Well, quite a bit actually. Stick around and you'll find out. And you'll see that there's far more to these stories than meets the eye. And it's not just me telling you this. This is based on medical science. But I call it the battle between the ears. But it's something our 5.8 class sailors will also know quite well, and guard themselves from it at all costs, even if they don't use the same words as we'll use to describe it. Hi, this is Captain Tom again. I'm United States Coast Guard MMC, Master Mariner Captain. I've been a skipper of sailing boats from dinghies up to 70 feet and sailed in almost every ocean. I've been a boat owner, charter master, bareboat charter qualifier, sailing instructor, and have assisted in hundreds of sailors in embryo achieve their dreams. Today I want to talk to you about 4 things you must get rid of before you leave shore. By the end of this video, I think you'll agree, and more importantly, recognize yourself when this baggage is coming along with you, so you can identify and jettison it appropriately. So let's get started. But first, if you like this content, please punch on that subscribe and like button and set the notification bell so you get all of the future content that I'll put out about this epic and unprecedented circumnavigation, as well as the many others on the topic of sailing, voyaging, and yacht racing I'll create. Got it punched? Let's go! To start out with, I'm going to switch over to one of my other proficiencies, as that of a pilot, and you'll see why in a moment. For context, think of the difference between being a boat skipper and an airplane pilot purely in terms of the number of dimensions involved. On the sea, we are essentially in 2 dimensions. In the air, we're in 3. But the psychology behind the survival instincts between the two is really the same. On that note, we're going to explore in what in aviation is called aeronautical decision making, ADM. And to be clear, I'll just be scratching the surface here. There are people who dedicate whole careers and attain PhDs on this subject. And when you think about it, it makes sense. Imagine all of the worldwide airline flights that are made daily and the split-second decisions that must be made in innumerable critical situations. Be rest assured that there is an entire science behind why pilots make the decisions that they do, and how to understand and train them for the circumstances and best possible outcomes. This is also applicable and critical to those of us who skipper in the 2-dimensional world of the sea as well. Now, I'll start by telling you a personal story. When I was just a young pilot, probably less than 100 hours of experience, I took off from a small airport in what we call visual flight rating. or VFR. VFR really just means that I'm flying the plane mostly by what I see out of the window. This is opposed to IFR, which is when a pilot is flying purely by their instruments in limited visibility. I was only a VFR pilot, not an IFR pilot, and thus I was not qualified to fly in limited visibility by instruments, nor really trained to do so. In this flight, I soon found that my aircraft was accumulating ice on the wings in limited visibility. Now this can be a fatal problem. Eventually, there can be enough ice on the wings that they lose their lift, and the plane becomes heavy enough that it just drops out of the sky. I made a split-second decision to return to the airfield. I could have gone above the clouds in a mode called OTT over the top and get to my destination, but I really didn't have the experience to do that, especially if my destination was in the clouds. So I returned to the airfield and set up my final approach. This being my first time in this sort of situation, I was totally stressed out. And of course, as luck would have it, I bounced the plane as I touched down. Now, those of you who are pilots know this can be a critical problem if it's not handled right. I bounced high enough that there was a real risk that if I stalled the wings at that height, that I would either cause damage to the aircraft as a minimum, or worse, cartwheel the plane. If I did that, there was a real chance that I would not be talking to you right now, or to anybody. As I bounced, though, my training kicked in, and I knew within a split second that I needed to apply significant power to the plane and keep it above stall speed. But this was completely against what my comfort zone was telling me to do. I had half a second or less to make a decision. My comfort zone was telling me to get the plane down. After all, it's only 20 feet or so in the air. So close. I could see safety right there. But my ADM told me that reaching the ground in that way would be catastrophic. My gut instinct, influenced by my training, told me to take off again and go all the way around the airfield and back to the same runway again, even if it meant going back out and accumulating more ice on the wings and risking total catastrophe. It was a decision based on the balance between what I could ascertain was my ice risk versus cartwheeling the plane in a bad landing. So around I went again, adding an agonizing 10-minute addition to my ordeal. I added power to the aircraft and pointed into the inky blackness that only promised more ice. After what seemed an eternity, I was able to come around per pilot rules, taking no risky shortcuts, much to the agony of my comfort zone, and arrive at my final approach again. I breathed some deep breaths and landed the plane without a bounce. I taxied to the aircraft tie-down, rotated the plane, and leaned the mixture to shut the engine off safely in its parking spot. Oof. I just sat there in the cockpit for a minute or so in the dark, with the sub-zero temps creeping in and the wind buffeting the aircraft. Needless to say, that moment I will never forget. And little did I realize at the time, following my ADM is what kept me alive. I also didn't realize that I had touched all of the main tenets of the ADM in just those few anxious minutes. If you have some experiences like that, I'd love to hear from you. Every situation is different. I want to hear about them. Each edifies in its own way. So I'll leave a link for the FAA, that's the Federal Aviation Administration, an agency of the United States government website, at the end of this video where you can find additional details. So with that, however, let's get into the first ADM attitude that you must leave ashore, and that's anti-authority. The definition of anti-authority is the belief that people should not be forced to obey authority figures and should be free to act as they wish, or someone who is hostile towards authority. Now, this philosophy will definitely cause trouble when Mother Nature is in charge, both in the air and on the water. So let's see where anti-authority, or the lack thereof, interacted with my personal story above. Now, in my humble opinion, this attitude was avoided when I made the decision to turn back to the originating airport rather than risk flying above the cloud layer. While it would have been legal for me to do that, it would have also been very risky, if not illegal, per my pilot status on the way down at the destination. Instead, I decided not to be in anti-authority in this case, and turned around to my originally departing airfield. Had I gone ahead, however, I would have at some level defied authority by likely breaking a rule of my given pilot rating. So where do we see this when we're on the water? So I would say potentially quite often we see it in situations like this. Number one, a crew member that maybe says they will wear a safety harness, but when you come up on deck as the skipper, you see that they do not have one on. Another example, a skipper that is ignorant of the racing rules on the starting line of a crowded race. Number three, sometimes it's more subtle, like a crew member that extends their watch beyond what they should to let their relief get more rest, only to put the ship at risk and that they themselves will not be alert on their next watch. So as a summary, I consider anti-authority to be objecting to or ignoring the authority that created the rules for the voyage. The second ADM attitude to leave ashore: impulsivity. And the definition is acting without forethought. This played a role in my personal story above when I made the bounce on my first landing attempt. The impulsive thing to do would have been to reduce power and just get the plane down on the ground. Very, very likely this would have been a disaster, however. The fact that I'm here to tell you this story is an indication that I kept this attitude at bay at the time. So where do we see this on the water? Again, quite often, and perhaps more often than the anti-authority attitude. I'll give you a couple examples. One, a skipper that leaves the dock with beginner students without having their life jackets on. This could also be anti-authority as well, if you look at it that way. Number two, taking the crew on a journey for which they are not prepared, or in conditions that they're not prepared to be in. So I call it the time is money syndrome. Or just when yourself or the crew does something just really risky and silly, even when they know better. Impulsivity results in making risky decisions that can have bad consequences. Leave it ashore. The third ADM attitude the FAA talks about, and is best just to leave ashore: machoism. And this probably needs little explanation. However, machoism can take a subtle form. In my personal story above, perhaps it would have been the macho thing to do to not have to go around and land again, since I had to tell the tower that I needed to do so. Was I worried about what the tower would think when I told them I had to go around again? Oh, not in the slightest. But can I always say that? So let's think about this on the water where we see it. One example, a crew or skipper that takes daredevil risks just to show off. Two, a skipper that keeps to a calendar schedule, ignoring a potentially dangerous weather situation, only to save face for the crew, owner, or some other entity looking on. A skipper who knowingly goes out in weather far exceeding good judgment, just to prove some sort of point. In other words, machoism is just showing off. Leave it ashore. The fourth attitude is invulnerability. I call this the "it won't happen to me" attitude. Of course, it's similar to some of the anti-authority attitudes we've talked about, except for the emotion behind it. From my personal experience above, I definitely did not have any feeling that I was invulnerable. Quite the opposite. But had I felt invulnerable, I would have likely done two things differently as really bad decisions. One is to go above the clouds, keep on to my destination, and potentially not be able to get down without an instrument approach, something that I had very little experience with. Number two, ignore the probable danger of my landing bounce. Just go with it. It's not going to happen to me. I'm not going to have a problem. Okay? You'd be surprised by how many pilots succumb to this attitude. And I think it's also possible that this attitude gets worse with experience, not better. It's sort of an expression of recency bias. Now, how do we see this on the water? Skippers or crew ignoring rules because they feel that they are the exception and won't be affected. Number two, taking shortcuts with safety equipment or training procedures. It's kind of similar in action to the anti-authority. Now let's move on to the one which I think is different than the others, and that is of resignation. I call this the panic, the freak out, or freeze up attitude. Often this is the most difficult one to keep away. It is not always a free will process to keep it away. Now, had I froze up in my wing icing experience, I would have been unable to apply power to the aircraft when I needed it. A stall and probable crash would have been the outcome. Now, how do we see this on the water? So, number one, a panicked radio call from a boat where the skipper or crew are unable to do anything except call on the radio. Often they are unable to comprehend any advice that's given to them. Number two, a skipper or crew who is unable to respond to an emergency. The deer in the headlight syndrome. Number three, a skipper or crew which does the exact opposite of what they would rationally do otherwise. I think you get the idea. During pilot training, we learned that the most important thing to realize with all of these ADM attitudes is to be able to identify and recognize when they are present. When we know that one is creeping into a situation, then we are better able to head it off at the pass, so to speak. But the most important thing here is we need to be honest with ourselves. When you realize that you're likely not being honest with yourself, then you know that that's one of the signs that the ADM traits are probably creeping in. We are all guilty of these ADM attitudes at one time or another. So let's sum up these attitudes. 1. Anti-authority. I'm going to ignore or protest a rule. Number 2. Impulsivity. Just get it done now, no matter what. And this is kind of the time is money argument. Machoism. I need to show off or save face. Invulnerability. This won't happen to me. I'm an exception, or I'm better than this. Yeah, good luck with that, buddy. Resignation. I'm overwhelmed. I can't take this. I give up right now. You know, there's an old saying, there are old pilots and bold pilots, but there are no old, bold pilots. Now, I like to push the fun meter when I sail as much as anybody and explore new waters in unfamiliar places. But ADM has helped me to learn the difference between boldness, which I consider just recklessness or unpreparedness, and fun and adventure. And I use it whenever I'm either sailing by myself on an inland lake or when I'm a skipper on the open water with 100 plus passengers that have given me the honor of trusting their lives to me. So please, take some time to learn ADM, even though it's not sailing per se. Now, if you haven't clicked subscribe, like, and notification yet, here's your chance. Now I'll be going into some other areas of this genre with subjects such as the 3 Ps, task saturation, failure fixation, and other fascinating things to discover, which is really about each of us, really. So in the meantime, let's watch and cheer our 5.8 meter class skippers and learn some from our friends that sail high above us. There is truly more than meets the eye. See you next time.